Now, I'm calling this lesson In Defense of Prohibition. So to define prohibition really quick, from 1920 to 1933, the sale and manufacture of alcohol was illegal in America. Whenever we learn about this time, whenever you hear about this time, you tend to sort of laugh at it, or you tend to think that, oh, everyone back then was just a stick in the mud who didn't want to have any fun. But in reality, there's a lot more to prohibition than a lot of people realize. So today what I want to do is sort of talk you through what some of the pros were of prohibition, but then at the end I'm going to tell you about why it ultimately didn't end up working out and why it probably never had a chance to work out. Prohibition was passed with the 18th Amendment to the Constitution, and it was enforced through the Volstead Act. And the reason why Prohibition passed, there was a group called the Women's Christian Temperance Movement, or the Women's Christian Temperance Union, and they felt very strongly that alcohol needed to be abolished. And the iconic picture of the Women's Christian Temperance Union is some very haggard looking older women who have a sign that says, "Lips that have touched alcohol shall not touch ours." And it's an ironic and kind of funny picture, but in reality, they did have a little bit of a point. So a few of the reasons why so many people, it wasn't just the Women's Christian Temperance Union, it was a large movement in America, and the reason why it was a movement was a few things, and I'm going to line them out here. Number one, a high rate of men coming home drunk and abusing their wives and children. And this is something that was blamed on alcohol. Men would come home and why, especially at the time, women really didn't have the voice that they do now. Up until 1919, 1920, women couldn't vote. And so in the 1800s, the early 1900s, women don't have a voice or any chance to defend themselves at all, and children certainly not. Another problem that was happening at the time was over drinking. If you think that consumption of alcohol is bad now, before Prohibition, consumption of alcohol was way worse. Tons and tons of people were drinking much more, and all through the day. It wasn't just at night. People would wake up in the morning and drink. They would drink at lunch. So one of the successes that Prohibition did have, and there aren't many, is that people stopped drinking so much, and there are less problem drinkers now than there were then. Now another one, and this one to me seems obvious that it would be a big problem: workplace accidents. At the time, a ton of Americans worked in factories with super dangerous machinery. And you can imagine how bad of a combination this is. A guy comes to work super drunk, and he's working a dangerous machine. He is a danger to himself and others. And so that is another just huge thing. Workplace accidents were extremely high. People were losing arms. People were losing legs. They were harming other people working this machinery that didn't really have safety regulations in the 1900s and late 1800s. And finally, and this is where we start to shift and see maybe the darker side, the worst side of Prohibition. And this is where the defense stops. And this is where I start to say, this is probably not the best idea, although maybe it was well-intentioned. Prohibition was known as the noble experiment. That's the famous name that you see for it a lot of times. Like, essentially saying, hey, good effort, but that was never really going to work. And one of the bad reasons why is because alcohol was usually tied to immigrants, particularly German immigrants and Irish immigrants. And so in the early 1900s and late 1800s, you have a massive influx of immigrants coming in, and Americans who are worried that they're going to lose their traditional way of life. They're worried that these immigrants coming in are going to change the moral fiber of America, particularly because they had immigrant saloons. And if you think that things that happen at a bar now are bad, the saloon was about 10 times worse. There was all kinds of bad stuff that happened there: heavy drinking, gambling, even prostitution in a lot of cases. This immigrant saloon was seen as a real moral danger but it's where immigrants connected with people from their homeland. So a big reason why people wanted to get rid of drinking was because of the immigrant saloon and kind of an anti-immigrant sentiment. So whenever people came in, they were usually bombarded with this stuff. So another big problem about Prohibition, from 1929 all the way up to the Second World War, America's going to be in the Great Depression, and people needed jobs, and alcohol was not taxable at the time that the Great Depression started because of Prohibition. So the problem is that you took what was taxable in alcohol, and now it's not taxable. Another big problem in that same vein, alcohol was the fifth largest industry in America. The fifth largest industry in America, tying back to my last point, is a pretty humongous job creator. So a lot of people lost their jobs and they went to criminals. It turned into organized crime. This is where people like Al Capone come into play, that famous American gangster. So that alcohol industry that had been in the hands of hardworking, probably pretty honest Americans now goes to organized crime. So the final and probably most obvious, and I would argue the biggest reason why Prohibition doesn't work out, people just don't listen. People wanted to drink, and they were going to drink no matter what. And what this led to was alcohol that was basically poisonous. People would take paint thinner and other things that had industrial alcohol in them, and they would sort of change the whatever it is inside of it that makes it toxic. But the problem is that, they weren't very good at that. That usually was done in like some dude's basement. So alcohol was poisonous. It was causing people to hallucinate. It was causing people to go blind because, again, it wasn't being made by a real company. It was being made by like Jimbo down the road. And people were going to drink no matter what. And the government was losing money. The people were losing money. So eventually the 18th Amendment gets repealed and replaced by the 21st Amendment, which allows alcohol to be legal again. But again, I want you to remember what I said at the beginning. We tend to laugh at Prohibition. It's kind of a joke. Can you believe that these old fogies tried to ban alcohol? Well, their heart may have been, in a lot of cases, in the right place, and it really was responding to some real social problems of the time. So thank y'all so much for listening. Have a great day.